If
Okay,
that's
that's
good,
perfect. Thank you.
okay, then I'm going to basically leave it for at the end we'll go and you'll moderate as you do all the time and we can go from there. So I have provocatively called this discussion today bringing a rule book to a bulldozer fight. And I wrote a Substack blog on this a couple of weeks ago, but in a highly dynamic and charged international system full of events and with a dynamic, a vector, a speed that I've never seen in my life before. I've already had to update what we're talking about yet again. But I don't have to change what my theme is, which is why Canada must stop playing for applause and start playing to win. And my suggestion to you today is that the idea of winning is not about being in a position of moral superiority. Winning is being able to deal with the economic circumstances that we find ourselves in and finding a solution that will satisfy us, that is good enough to do what we need to do rather than an abject total failure. So just to set it all up, that we're not in an optimal world, we're in a world in some ways of foundational economic survival. So let's just think about this, because when I was thinking about this, in 8 weeks, we've had issues about the use of not just economic power, which is what I talk about, but actual kinetic power, military power, the use of force. So we've had two states, and I'm going to suggest to you that we have one toolbox. And what I mean by that is that we had the issue in January of Venezuela. We've had the issue in February, now in March, of Iran, which has focused everybody's time. And foundationally, the country that has the force, that's wielding the cruise missiles, whether it's going to be the SEAL team that was in Venezuela or the cruise missiles that are out in Tehran, is the same country that's wielding tariff weapons against Ottawa. And the reason why I bring that together is that the concept of military force and economic leverage is not something that I used to have to think about in the context of trade negotiation. In trade negotiation, we looked at a situation where we were building together a better world and everyone would benefit from that, or the classic non-zero sum game. And my suggestion is going to be that maybe some of those basic assumptions have changed a little bit. So, foundational, what I want to say by way of the central argument is that it's not that bad for Canada yet. Canada has leverage it has not used. And there are exits that exist in the system. And the law actually permits them. And when I mean the law, I mean the trade agreements have provisions. The architecture that we may need is already in place, but we have actually not been using them. What's been missing in my submission to you is not an absence of legal authority, but it's a domestic infrastructure that we have that can exercise that authority that hasn't, and a will to build it. In other words, we have powers that we've declined to use in the past and a need to have will to build it forward. So the question's not whether to fight, but it's whether we're going to stop being aspirational and a focus by bringing what I say a rule book to a bulldozer fight. Are we going to be able to deal with things? And we don't have to have a bulldozer to a bulldozer. You could just have something that's bad enough that you might be able to negotiate a transactional answer. In other words, we have more than we've used. Now we need to think about that. So let me walk through what I mean. I told you this would be provocative. So one, the world view, my Weltanschauung, as we call it, has changed. We've moved from to a world now where interest-based power, sometimes I use the word economic statecraft, has replaced the rules-based order. The world that I have lived in, the world where I've negotiated, the world where I would focus on. And so I need to first bring to you why and how the CUSMA became a leverage instrument and why Canada's playbook is wrong. Not because we've designed it to be wrong, but because I'm going to suggest to you we're playing a game that's no longer being played by other people. And that is a error of strategy. So let's look at the old game. I've given you an old game and a new game. So let's just turn to the box in blue over on the left, the old rule book. We're looking at a rules-based trade order where CUSMA is a partnership treaty. Certainly when we were working on the NAFTA, that's how we saw it, and the earlier CUSTA, the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. We use dispute settlement as our arbiter. In other words, independent bodies to decide on issues. We argued from principle and shared values, thinking what we could do to make things better across the board. And our backstop was always the WTO, the World Trade Organization rules, shaped by America, but heavily influenced by Canada, going all the way back to the WTO original, the original charter from the Havana Charter from 1947, which Canadians were deeply involved. Saul Ray, Bob Ray's father, was the person who drafted it and chaired that conference. So, I mean, there's a deep Canadian connection to the building of that process. And we see Davos as being important. I've been to Davos 10 times in the World Economic Forum. I deeply participated. That was the world I was in and participated in and saw things in. But that's what I call the rule book. Now, our problem is that the new game is what I call the bulldozer. And the bulldozer is interest-based power. That power is transactional, but based on what you can project, what you can deploy. And we're not thinking about a long-term plan, we're thinking about a today plan. What did you do for me lately? So in the old game, the rule book is about maybe a trade marriage, and the new game is transactional. For those who are younger with us today, they'll know it when I call it a situationship rather than a deep relationship. The new game is designed as a 16-year lease. And those are the words of Jared Kushner, who was involved in negotiating. He said it's like a real estate deal. We get a new building, we lease it up, so we fill it up with people, and then whoever has more power can extract extra rents on short-termism. We do that. That's why the review was put in. It was the design feature. It's not a bug. It was designed that way. We saw CUSMA as a bug, and we saw this review as a minor issue. It's not. It was designed always to be that way. And so instead of having dispute settlement and the WTO to deal with it, we see IEEPA tariffs. We see Section 232 and the 301s. The 232s are what are sectoral tariffs, causing so much pain to our Canadian economy in autos, in auto assembly, in steel, aluminum, lumber. Those are all 232 tariffs. They have a legal process, but that process is one that is uneven. I'm a member of that court, the U.S. Court of International Trade. It's not a fair fight because the law is designed to make it very difficult for a foreign party to be able to get a fair shake. Similarly, Section 301, which is the next one. If you say that there's a violation of the trade agreement, for the Americans, they say that most of our digital issues are violations, and they also say our HST is a violation, justifying an ability to put across-the-board tariffs. That's coming. That process has started, but the big process is coming. And now we currently have the Section 122 tariffs, the temporary ones, the ones that are good for up to 15%, for up to 150 days. And Secretary of the Treasury Bessent has said that we should expect in the next week the tariffs to go and be increased from 10% there to 15%. And it also could very easily apply to the entirety of the Canadian economy. In other words, not having a CUSMA carve-out, which we have right now, which is shielded so much. So what I'm suggesting to you is that the same toolbox, the same approach of economic statecraft that we see for Venezuela, we see with Iran, we might see with Greenland, it's just the target will change rather than the piece, because it's about the projection of power, be it economic power, be it military power, being technological power, be it critical minerals power, being energy, as in power of power. They all come together. And so we no longer have a WTO to be able to deal with the rule of law. It's paralyzed. Allies become the targets. So rather than just a world where you're focused on could be Russia, could be China. The allies have become the targets as much as anything else. And tariff threats are now a very daily operating tool. So that's a new game, and we need to think about it in a different way. So why do I say that Canada's playing the wrong game? And that's because we have a dominant worldview. And that worldview that we've been calibrating, that we've been focusing on, is a world where we see non-zero sum gains. We see that we can work together, build a better place. But that's no longer shared. That's a neoliberal view. In many respects, that neoliberal view has been gone for a long time. We just didn't really realize it. In fact, the Americans have been pushing an economic statecraft model, even during the Biden administration. It just became so abundantly clear with the Trump administration. And the difference between Biden and Trump is that the Trump administration gloats. They are totally transparent. They tell us what they're going to do, and then they do it. We hear what they say, and then we kept saying, oh, they'd never do that. I used to get calls all the time from leading American media groups and their editorial board saying, can he do that? As in, can the president legally do this on trade? And the answer I'd say is probably not, but by the time you find out, it's going to be a year, and you're going to have to get it from the Supreme Court. And lo and behold, it took almost about a year, and we had to hear from the Supreme Court. And even though they took one lever away from the president, they didn't take away his leverage because he had other tools, which he's using. So what's our problem? 4 things I'm going to suggest. 1, we don't have SAGITs, strategic advisory groups. Canada used to have these bodies that could advise on trade negotiation, where you could mobilize, you have command and control and have everybody all connected, security cleared, industrial intelligence, trade, legal, industrial knowledge, technical knowledge. The US still has that. They have a thing called ITACs. They have 1,000 people who are connected. And when the negotiations start, they are all going to be, in essence, at the table. There's going to be one negotiator, but they're going to be able to connect to all these people online in real time in the negotiating room. Canada got rid of that after NAFTA, and we bring nothing to the table. So we only have our negotiators, and they're going to deal with detailed issues on energy and detailed issues on financial market regulation and detailed issues on AI and digital. And we don't have anybody to connect to, and they have everybody connected. That's a problem in my submission. Second, we have by Canadians, they were always available to us, but we never took it over. In other words, the Americans had put provisions in the treaty that would allow for local purchase, local preference, local ability, and they had the Buy America Act, and they did it. In Canada, we decided that was a bad idea, that was morally wrong, so we didn't buy Canadian. So we didn't claim that right. The Americans did it. They kept doing it all the time. And what happened? Our chip foundries moved from Canada to the United States because they did the CHIP Acts under Biden. And so very good Canadian technology companies moved from Canada to the US because they were putting so much money out. And when I ask the CEOs now, because they're still Canadian companies with operations, they say they're not coming back because they have to pay back the money, and they're operating. So while the program looked protectionist, it was always available under the CUSMA the entire time. The US ran it, Canada, we saluted the flag and we stepped aside. And that was playing the wrong game. The game had already changed. We just decided it wasn't a good idea because it was morally bad and it cost us in innovation and productivity. And now we're paying the price. The third, the issue about the Cloud Act. And I wrote a wonderful paper that's been published on the 10th of March as a Balsillie special paper about the Cloud Act. The Cloud Act is a U.S. piece of extraterritorial legislation that allows for the legal process to surveil foreign data, to take foreign data and bring it into the U.S. courts and produce it. And Canada never challenged the Cloud Act, and Canada didn't put blocking legislation that would give a legal ability for a Canadian company to not follow the Cloud Act. We did that for Helms-Burton. We did that for anti-Cuba legislation. We have a piece of legislation called FEMA, the Foreign Extraterritorial Measures Act, but we never did that with respect to the Cloud Act. And the fourth area is digital sovereignty. We don't actually have an AI law. I just attended discussions here in Paris about the EU AI Act and what it means and how it's been working out. Canada doesn't have that. We have issues with how we deal with our digital regulation, with how we're going to handle the regulation with the CRTC. We have issues about online harms. Our digital ad market's pretty well largely unregulated. We fund research, foreign companies capture the patents, and then we pay to rent that back. So here's our portfolio, what I call our leverage. What is it that we can do? What is it that we can build to try to provide an answer? So, of course, just the very simple things, we have energy. So we have 3.9 million barrels of oil that goes to the US every day. That's more than all other nations combined. $1 trillion of pension fund investment in the US. That is significant. 34 states count Canada as their single largest export market. So export and markets are very significant. Canada, the energy that's imported from Canada, the US, is 4 times more than all the energy that's exported north. That's a structural dependency from the US on Canadian energy. Critical minerals. 46 of the 50 critical minerals listed by the US are found in Canadian deposits and could be available for US needs. Right now, they're getting almost all of that material is coming from China. So that's a significant problem because China threatened to cut them off. And that's a serious issue, and thus the reason for the Balsillie Legal Advisory submission to the U.S. Trade Representative on how to build that. And it's a good read. I recommend it if anybody has some extra time. And the key thing is $350 billion US a year of US goods exported to Canada. Canada as a market outranks China, Japan, and Mexico. As a market for US goods, as a market for US services, especially in the digital space. So Canada has leverage because it's a market. Canada has leverage because it supplies energy. Canada has leverage because it has critical minerals. Canada has all that leverage, but we haven't actually used it. I'll get in a moment to how to use it, okay? And on energy, basically, I've sort of talked about the key issues. I do want to talk about the clean electricity issue in particular, okay? Foundationally, and Jatin has done a fabulous, fabulous paper looking at this and about the ability to create a better ability inside Canada to deal with this. But at the end of the day, Canada's grid is 82% emission-free, and that generates about $320 billion worth of GDP, and that's very significant. And so I just want to flag that. On critical minerals, Canada's answer is deeply significant from the Ring of Fire, from we have Saskatchewan, that tailings from the oil sands have scandium and vanadium in them. Who knew? And the ability to get the Port of Churchill to work gives us a supply chain route that creates supply chain resiliency by having another way of getting things through. And the only good news I can tell you is that there was a ministerial held with 53 countries in February by the Americans on critical minerals, and Canada didn't sign it. And the reason why I say that's good is that Canada didn't sign it because they knew this would come up in the CUSMA talks. And that was the first bit of smart leverage negotiation that I've seen us do to date. So, 5 exits. What is Canada not using? I'm going to just walk through them. There are scope exclusions in the CUSMA. We're not using them. We have what's called essential security. That is where we can, for national security, foundationally, based on our own view, we can have an exception to the terms of the trade agreement. We've never used it. We've never suggested it. We've never followed it. The U.S. uses it quite frequently. We have for greater certainty clauses. They confirm that regulatory space exists. Now, that is not the strongest piece, but it's structurally easier to negotiate than a new exception. We have Annex 1 and 2 reservations. These are reservations done for existing and future measures, and they have been put into different chapters. The investment chapter, the financial services chapter, the telecom chapter, they're all there. So they're already in the architecture, and thus they give us an ability to be able to carve out more, to preserve and protect more. We don't use them very frequently, if ever. And then we have what I call horizontal exceptions. Exceptions to go across all chapters of the CUSMA. They're horizontal. They're general exceptions. They deal with cultural industries. It's not really an exemption because we're still subject to retaliation, but there are pieces that go with that. So 5 pieces. I mentioned the Cloud Act, so I'm not going to tell you about that. I'll give you the answer. 1, we have to stop playing for applause. Applause is not what we're looking for, and we make a mistake when we take sentiment and morality. That world is sort of over. This is a transactional world. We need to think about it in a different way. So I would suggest that our best way is to look to Sun Tzu, The Art of War. First, I'll give you 3 pieces. The supreme art of war is subdue the enemy without fighting. So build quietly. An example, sovereign compute. Clean energy, industrial policy gets around the Cloud Act. You do that by way of data governance modernization. You put some FEMA blocking regulations in. You build the capacity without telegraphing confrontation. In other words, we can do things without being confrontational, but we need to build. That's the first very important part of the strategy. Second, we need to think very carefully about sequencing. Okay? And Sun Tzu said, he who knows when he can fight and when he cannot will be victorious. So sequencing is really important. So Canada can use the existing essential security exemption without domestic legislation. And we can use that to deal with our essential security. So we can invoke a treaty exception without having to build new institutional capacity. And by doing that, we can build our domestic architecture first and deal with the treaty table second. Right now, the treaty table is defining and restraining the domestic table. That's backwards. We need to fix that. And it's in a variety of areas, most significantly in the digital area. And the third, we need to deploy strategically. And this again, go back to Sun Tzu, appear weak when you are strong and strong when you are weak. So our leverage, energy, minerals, investment from our pension funds, digital markets, it's real. And in a point that was recently made in the Globe and Mail by Brian Crawley, our leverage is there, but we haven't made the energy case clearly. We haven't been consistent. We need to make it calmly and precisely without emotional provocation, without baggage. Leverage that's telegraphed prematurely loses its effect. So we need to deploy carefully and cautiously and at the right time. So build quietly, sequence correctly, deploy strategically is basically, I think, the best plan going forward. And so what I'd say is to do now some things, have a critical minerals statecraft, come up with our own approach to deal with a blocking piece of legislation so you can protect the Canadian companies under the Cloud Act. 3, put the Sajits back. That's a no-brainer. I don't know why we haven't done that. 4, create a Digital Sovereignty Act. 5, start doing the steps for sovereign compute. That's the now issues. Then at the negotiations, start worrying about annexes for reservations. Think about essential security. You don't have to say it. You just have to, because it's going to be there. You have to know it. Think about supply chain data governance. I think we should do a chapter on that personally. Put IP retention as an annex. Follow the American Bayh-Dole Act. And replace the veto that we currently have in on our Chinese policy. That's the poison pill that we ran into a foul on with respect to our negotiations with the Chinese on EVs. Replace that with a joint consultation. No other country should be able to tell Canada what its policy with China should be. We can negotiate a process, but we shouldn't have a veto from our trading partners. Okay? So that would be my foundational suggestion on the sequencing for us to go ahead. And just to close up, the tests: sovereignty, prosperity, agency. Sovereignty is what I mean by saying, if you can't say who decides, you've lost it. That's sovereignty, and that's really important on the digital side. Okay? You need to be able to have the power to decide. Prosperity is about being able to build the capacity to do what you need to do. And that is foundationally looking at innovation and our ability to deal with that. And agency, the part we don't think about. If you can't walk away from a bad deal, you've lost it. Agency is the part. If Trump threatens 100% tariffs and we concede, we foundationally lost our agency. So you need to figure out how to keep your agency. And that's not an easy job because it's a very difficult situation. So those are the three tests that I would leave. And as I call it, the exits exist. That's the name of the paper that I'm just going to put out. There's a domestic architecture, as I talked about today. So there are ways for us to be able to get out of this mess. There's a way for us to sequence the approach. There's a way for us to use our leverage, but in a smart and strategic way. And we need to think about it. So reliable and committed doesn't necessarily mean that we have to be agreeable. It means that we're sovereign. Sovereignty is the essence at the end of the day, because we want the ability to have agency, the ability to decide yes or no. And so I'm going to just leave you with those thoughts. And I'm sorry I packed in a lot, but I promised I'd have this all done in 30 minutes so we could have time to talk. But the idea is simply that we find ourselves in a different world, in a different game, and requiring different tools. And in that situation, rather than giving up, I would suggest to you that we have a lot of capacity, but we need to think about it in a different way, apply a strategic voice and view in a different way. And so I am very interested in having your comments and views, your discussion, because we need to figure out together what's going to be the best way to handle the very, very significant challenges that stand right now before Canadians and the Canadian government. So with that, Jatin, I'm just going to send it right back to you.
Thank you, Barry. This was feisty, if I may say so, but very thoughtful and also constructive in terms of what one might do.